In September 1944, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout received a simple, almost banal order: fly to Peleliu, photograph the enemy airfield, return home. No heroism, no glory, just a reconnaissance mission. At 6 in the morning, the deep roar of the F-6F Hellcat's engine cut through the air like a promise of routine. He believed it would be just another uneventful flight, but the war that day had other plans. The sky was clear when the plane crossed the 8,000-foot mark. The automatic camera mounted under the fuselage did its job emotionlessly, clicking at regular intervals. Below, the island of Peleliu seemed asleep. Command had assured that the Japanese airfield was abandoned, destroyed by previous bombings, but as he approached, a metallic glint caught Stout's eye. He adjusted his course, squinted, and his blood ran cold. What he saw was not a graveyard of planes, but an army about to take off. Dozens of Mitsubishi Zeros and Nakajima bombers lined up wing to wing, fuel stacked in drums, mechanics scurrying between the rows, and pilots in helmets adjusting their belts. That was no abandoned base. It was a living, pulsing nest primed for attack. For a few seconds, the silence inside the cockpit was almost unbearable. He counted quickly: 20, 30, 40 planes. All armed, all fueled. The clock read 0712. In 3 days, 28,000 U.S. Marines would land on those beaches. Stout understood what it meant. Those 40 fighters would be hell over the sea, capable of decimating the ships before the first boot touched the sand. The instruction, but what seemed like a suicidal attack would become, in the following minutes, the most devastating blow a single pilot ever struck in all of World War II. The deep roar of the engine cut through the dawn. The F-6F Hellcat dove like a falcon over the waters of Peleliu, and the air smelled of gasoline and salt. The order was clear: photograph the site, return, report. But at 8,000 feet, Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout realized that command was wrong, and that if he followed the rules, hundreds of men would die. The sun rose, painting the Pacific in copper tones. Below, the Japanese airfield looked like a steel chessboard. Rows of Zeros and Nakajima bombers gleamed in the morning light. Fuel drums stacked, pilots running, mechanics tuning engines. That was no destroyed base. It was a swarm ready to take off. Stout saw what no one else could. The attack was already loaded, and he was the only American there. On the panel, the gauges trembled. 2,400 rounds, little more than 12 seconds of continuous fire. No bombs, no missiles, just the 6.50 Brownings shuddering under the wings. It was enough for an insane or miraculous gesture. And in that instant, protocol died inside him. He climbed higher. He observed the entire field. Planes lined up too closely, too much fuel, too short a distance. Just one spark. His heart beat like a machine gun. His mind weighed duty against instinct. Returning was right. Attacking was unthinkable. But sometimes the unthinkable is the only path between life and disaster. Stout pushed the stick. The Hellcat dove. The horizon split into two colors, blue and green. The altimeter spun quickly: 6,000 feet, 4,000, 2,000. The jungle blurred past. The plane's hull vibrated as the engine hit maximum power. He flew less than 50 feet off the ground, so low he felt the air pushing the wings like a solid wave. The figures below began to move. Some pointed, others ran. The engine's roar reached them seconds before the shots. Stout squeezed the trigger. 6 trails of fire cut the air. Tracer bullets tore through the first Zero, pierced the thin metal, and he saw the fuel gush into flames. He banked the stick, aiming at the stacked drums between 2 bombers. 12 rounds hit dead on. Hell was born in a second. The explosion sent up a column of fire that touched the sky. The shock wave shook the Hellcat as if it were made of paper. Beneath him, the flames raced across the ground like a freed beast, jumping from plane to plane, turning the runway into a living furnace. The Japanese panicked. They ran directionless, screaming, trying to reach the defense towers, but it was too late. The first bomber exploded, then the second, then the third. The temperature rose so fast, the air seemed to boil. Stout pulled the stick. The Hellcat climbed, gasping. The panel flashed red. The radio hissed with interference. Behind him, the north row of the field burned entirely. More than 20 aircraft blazed like torches. And then the shots came. The Japanese anti-aircraft batteries awoke. Bursts of 20mm fire cut the sky like needles of light. Tracer bullets passed inches from the cockpit. One hit the tail, another pierced the right wing. The plane shuddered but held flight. Stout banked left, zigzagging. The fire climbed too fast. Half the base was already ash and smoke. Still, he saw silhouettes of at least 20 intact planes at the south end. Instinct said, "Get out." His blood said, "Finish what you started." The sky seemed to scream around him. He took a deep breath, turned the plane, and dove again. The second pass would be suicidal, but it was the only way to stop the counterattack. What the Major would do now was not courage, it was destiny. He accelerated. The Hellcat roared again, descending under a hail of projectiles. This time, the Japanese were ready. The towers swiveled, spitting fire. The sound of machine guns echoed like thunder. But Stout pressed on. He targeted a fuel truck behind a group of bombers. He fired. The tracer bullets hit the tank dead center. The truck split open, fuel spraying in flaming jets. The next explosion was so strong it hurled debris 50 feet high. One bomber flipped end over end, another ignited in the air. Japanese ammunition began detonating one after another in sequence. The Hellcat emerged from the smoke, groaning, engine wounded but alive. Behind him, the Japanese base vanished under a black cloud rising to the sky. In less than 8 minutes, the Major had turned Peleliu's largest airfield into a flaming desert. The panel flashed, fuel leaked, but he smiled, briefly and without pride. He knew the mission was over and that he had just created a firestorm that would change the entire invasion. But the hero who had just destroyed 40 planes now faced a far more dangerous enemy, the American command itself. The sea stretched like a gray blade when the wounded Hellcat began its slow return to the USS Hornet. The cockpit trembled, the panel flashed. The smell of burned fuel invaded the air. Every metallic noise could be the last. Below, the island of Peleliu vanished under a black carpet of smoke. Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout looked back and saw the trail of what he had done. 40 enemy aircraft destroyed, an entire base in ruins, and a certainty he had just disobeyed a direct order. The engine coughed. The oil pressure needle swung dangerously. He lowered altitude, trying to ease the machine's strain. Every minute, fear stopped being a feeling and became calculation. How many miles to the Hornet? How much fuel left? How long before the engine died? The adrenaline of combat had faded, replaced by a heavy silence where the only sound was the snap of the wounded fuselage. When he finally sighted the carrier, the sun was beginning to set on the horizon. The smoke from the explosions was still visible for miles, like a fire monument in the middle of the ocean. Stout knew that sight would tell his story before he even opened his mouth. The control tower sounded cold and procedural. "Hellcat 309, aircraft status?" "Damaged," he replied, uncertain about the landing gear. The deck turned into the wind, preparing the rescue. The landing was a dry impact. The plane hit the deck, dragging sparks. One wheel locked, metal bending, smell of oil and gunpowder. Sailors ran, pointing, stunned. The tail was shredded by 20mm bullets, wings perforated, paint scorched. When the engine finally went silent, the entire deck fell silent too. No one spoke. Stout climbed down from the cockpit and faced the approaching officers. One of them, the squadron commander, shouted, "You were sent to photograph, Major. What the hell happened out there?" His gaze was steady, but there was no anger. There was shock. The pilot removed his helmet, still covered in ash, and replied in a hoarse voice, "They weren't dead. They were ready to attack, so I stopped them." The answer wasn't enough. In the hours that followed, he was interrogated by superiors, analysts, and intelligence officers. Each wanted to understand how a reconnaissance mission had turned into the most devastating single-man attack in the entire Pacific War. Initial reports didn't believe it. 40 planes destroyed by one Hellcat? Impossible. But Stout's own photographs, captured by the automatic camera before the dive, showed the intact field. And now reconnaissance planes flew over the same site, a desert of ashes. No Japanese aircraft remained airworthy, no fuel structures, no towers, nothing. Command was divided. Some wanted court-martial for insubordination. Others, absolute silence, fearing it would inspire other pilots to improvise. But one thing was undeniable. Thanks to Stout's disobedience, the 28,000 Marines preparing to land on Peleliu would face the enemy without the shadow of Japanese planes. During the interrogation, he was direct. "Gentlemen, if I had returned, you would have sent a squadron tomorrow. Tomorrow would have been too late." For a moment, no one replied. The carrier's captain, a man of stern expression, just nodded for him to be removed from the room. "Stand by for further orders." That night, the sea was silent. The major stood alone on the deck, watching the sunset reflected on the water. Far off, a dark smudge still rose from the horizon, the last remnant of the burning Japanese field. He knew he would face consequences, but he also knew that in that instant, hundreds of lives were being saved because he had chosen to act. Command sought insubordination, but history would see strategy. As the distant sound of engines echoed in the night, he allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. War was made of obedience, but that day salvation was born of rebellion. If real stories like this inspire you, men who defied orders and changed the course of the war, subscribe to the channel now. What comes next will show you how the impossible became proven fact. Because the next day, a simple aerial photo would prove what no one believed and transform Stout's disobedience into one of the greatest individual victories of World War II. At the next dawn, the USS Hornet hovered over a motionless sea, as if even the ocean awaited explanations. The rumor had already spread. A single pilot had returned with the plane in tatters and the absurd story of destroying 40 Japanese aircraft alone. Officers were divided between astonishment and disbelief. Some laughed, others called him a liar, but all wanted to know what really happened over Peleliu. On the deck, maintenance technicians swarmed Stout's Hellcat. Every hole in the metal was a silent confession. 20mm impact on the tail, perforations in the right wing, scorch marks near the cockpit. The fuselage was covered in soot, and something more. Remnants of ash and soot mixed with Japanese metal fragments stuck to the paint. It was the signature of the hell he had left behind. Inside the command room, the atmosphere was thick. The intelligence officer analyzed the photographs captured by the Hellcat's automatic camera. The last images before the dive showed the intact Japanese base packed with planes. And then, silence. No photos after. The camera had stopped recording seconds before the attack. No direct evidence, one officer said, just his word. But doubt began to crumble when reconnaissance planes sent that morning overflew Peleliu. Transmissions arrived in short radio bursts. Northfield completely destroyed. No operational aircraft. Structures reduced to ashes. The photos arrived at the Hornet hours later. They were developed in the ship's lab, one by one, under red light. And there, the truth burned on the photographic paper. 40 Japanese aircraft hulks, twisted like bones under the sun. The ground, charred. Rows of fuel drums turned into craters. The north runway, unrecognizable. The south, covered in debris and smoke. The destruction was so complete that analysts briefly believed the site had been napalmed, but no American plane besides Hellcat 309 had been there. The field report confirmed the impossible. One single pilot had eliminated the Japanese Air Force on the island, and with it, the threat to the invasion. The commander who had previously spoken of court-martial now stared at the floor in silence. The chain of command faced a dilemma: punish the insubordination or recognize the genius. Admiral Spruance, in an encrypted communique, sent a short instruction: no man should be punished for doing what war demands before orders arrive. In the Hornet's corridors, Stout went from insubordinate to legend, but he didn't seem satisfied. His countenance was that of someone who had seen something the world would never understand. He watched the sea from the deck, the sun reflecting off the debris stuck to his plane's wings, and remained silent. Meanwhile, on land, the Marines prepared the Peleliu landing. The updated intelligence report was dry and direct. No air threat, total control of airspace over the island. Few knew the reason. None knew the name of the man who had made it happen. 3 days later, the invasion began. The first boats touched the sand without a single Japanese bomber in the sky. The attacks that should have decimated the ships never happened. The troops advanced. The aerial silence enveloping them was the legacy of Stout's solitary act. On the USS Hornet, the words court-martial were struck from the report, replaced by another phrase: extraordinary conduct under extreme conditions. Shortly after, the major was called to the commander's office. A document on the table, a stamp, and the sentence: High Command recognizes your initiative. Medal recommended. Navy Cross. He didn't reply. He just nodded. Glory had never moved him. Only the awareness that sometimes war's clock ticks too fast, and those who wait for orders always arrive too late. Major Stout proved that valor lies not in following orders, but in understanding the purpose behind them. But while the medal was being prepared and the photos spread through Navy archives, a new enemy rose, and with it, oblivion. Decades later, the story of the pilot who disobeyed to save lives nearly vanished from the war's map.
Time passed, and with it, the war began to fade from the horizon. When the smoke of the Pacific cleared, Major Robert Cowboy Stout returned home in silence. No fanfare awaited him. The medal, the Navy Cross, America's second highest military honor, was delivered without ceremony, without speeches. Just a handshake and the bureaucratic phrase: for extraordinary bravery under enemy fire. To many, it was an award. To him, an uncomfortable reminder. In the following months, Stout tried to reintegrate into civilian life. He married, worked, raised children. But inside him was something time couldn't heal. The weight of a decision no one asked for. The memory of the fire rising from Peleliu's runway, the men running in desperation on the ground, and the sound that haunted him for decades. The crack of explosions echoing in his mind. He never spoke publicly about the attack. When someone asked what he had done in the war, he smiled vaguely and said, "Nothing worth telling." The Navy Cross stayed tucked in a wooden drawer, alongside a stopped clock and a burned handkerchief. To his children, he was just a pilot who came back alive. To the few surviving Hornet comrades, he was a legend who preferred oblivion to glory. Decades later, in the 1970s, historians began re-examining lost Pacific theater reports. Among thousands of gray pages, a name caught attention: Stout, Robert L. Peleliu Mission, September 12, 1944. The attached photos showed the impossible. 40 Japanese aircraft destroyed, the field turned to charcoal. The footnotes described unauthorized independent action and unprecedented tactical result. It was like finding a myth hidden among official papers. The story began to resurface. A veteran researcher from the Naval War College, intrigued by the report, located the pilot's family. When Stout's son answered the phone, he didn't know what it was about. "My father never talked about it," he replied. The historian explained, "Your father prevented the massacre of 28,000 Marines. He was the reason Peleliu's sky was clear." Silence. Then a trembling breath on the other end of the line. In 2005, when Stout died, The local newspaper obituary didn't mention the episode. Just 2 lines. World War II veteran, decorated for exemplary service. No details, no public remembrance. The story nearly ended there. Nearly. Years later, curious grandchildren found the old wooden drawer. Inside, the Navy Cross, the burned photos, and a faded diary. On one page, a single handwritten sentence. Obeying is safe. Acting is necessary. Those words reignited the past. Researchers cross-referenced declassified Japanese documents and found Peleliu base records, reports of total destruction, loss of 40 aircraft, and notes that a single enemy fighter attacked unexpectedly. Both sides, American and Japanese, confirmed the same truth. One man alone had done the impossible. The case was finally included in U.S. Naval Aviation Strategy Manuals as a study in independent tactical initiative. In military academies, it became a lesson that blindly obeying orders can cost more than deciding by instinct. Stout's silence was the continuation of his courage. He never sought recognition because he knew war's true merit is surviving it and remaining human. The world never heard his voice, but the smoke that rose from Peleliu that morning was witness enough. Decades later, historians would prove that solitary act had saved more than 1,000 lives, and unknowingly, Major Stout had become a symbol of one of the greatest lessons in military leadership of all time.
The legacy of Robert "Cowboy" Stout didn't fade with time, it just waited to be understood. When the Navy reports were finally declassified, the magnitude of his decision became evident. Military strategy experts reviewed the images, cross-checked data, compared attack timelines, and reached a surprising conclusion. If Stout had obeyed orders, Peleliu's Japanese Air Force would have launched its offensive before the American landing. Later estimates showed that between 800 and 1,000 Marines would have died in the first hours of the invasion. One man's disobedience had saved an entire army. The reports called it field initiative under extreme risk, but historians preferred another term: moral courage. Courage to see beyond bureaucracy, to understand that the true purpose of orders is to protect lives, not preserve reputations. Stout's act became studied in military academies under the concept of commander's intent, the idea that the soldier in the field, seeing the situation with his own eyes, can interpret the higher intent of the mission and act on his own when time is the enemy. The Navy hadn't sent Stout to attack, but to protect the invasion, and that's exactly what he did. Decades later, aviation instructors and young pilots would continue to repeat his name as a silent reminder. Orders are guides, not shackles. The story taught that in war, blind obedience can cost as much as error. Stout, however, never heard any of these praises. When he died in 2005, he was just an elderly man tending his garden and listening to the radio at sunset. But in history's archives, his solitary act had become one of the greatest individual actions in naval aviation. The Hellcat 309, restored from original parts, now stands on display in a California museum. On the plaque, just one sentence: "In 8 minutes, one pilot cleared the enemy sky." The public passing by doesn't hear the narration, doesn't feel the wind that pushed that plane, nor the sound of the machine guns, but every scratch on the fuselage is a line written in fire, a reminder that amid obedience and fear, there's always room for conscience. Stout's true heroism wasn't destroying 40 planes. It was having the discernment to act when everyone expected hesitation. He didn't seek to be remembered, and perhaps that's why his story deserves never to be forgotten. Because in the end, war isn't made just of orders, but of choices. And some choices, even the loneliest ones, echo for generations. Archival images show the Hellcat returning in black and white. smoke rising from the sea, the USS Hornet's deck covered in debris. The engine sound mixes with the final narration, as if the past still breathes. And the next time someone tells you that following orders is always the safest path, remember Major Stout flying over Peleliu and the silence he broke to save thousands of men. If this story made you reflect on what courage really means, share the video and subscribe to the channel. Here we retell the acts time tried to erase, real stories of men who defied orders and changed the course of the war. In war, there are those who follow orders and those who follow the truth.